House Bill 132, Representative Cruz, relative to the post-accident drug testing requirements. Gentleman moves to call it from the calendar.
Without objection. Representative Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, the public's being maimed by impaired drivers who can pass breathalyzer tests at the scene. Excuse me. Statutes created for drunk driving are no longer enough in a culture of functional meth and opioid users. If a driver is issued a traffic citation and causes an accident and someone is seriously injured, that person should be subject to a drug test. The citation should serve as probable cause. They cause the crash, someone may die from the injuries, and the victims have a right to know if they were impaired. And I'd like to introduce some amendments.
The amendments, Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, members, Representative Cruz offers Amendment 2249, two-page amendment that's been distributed.
Representative Cruz on your amendment.
And members, 2249, what it does is seeks to streamline our law and bring it in harmony with federal statutes regarding a term called suspected serious injury. This bill came out of an accident in the Bossier District. And what happens in current law, if there's a fatality, you do chemical testing. If there is no fatality, there's no chemical testing. In this instance, a little girl, Katie Grantham, was taken away from the from the accident scene in a coma and died a week later. So since she didn't die at the scene, it didn't fall under the current statute that says there must be a fatality at the scene.
For a question on the amendment, Representative Abramson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Cruz, I understood and I believe I support your original bill. I'm trying to understand the amendments and what you're changing the language serious bodily injury to suspected serious injury, and then it has some categories as to what that is, including quote unquote crash injuries, which could be a bruise, it could be anything, and it also says that if the person didn't get an actual citation, then they're not subject to the blood test or the chemical test.
Abramson, this came out from consultation with Louisiana State Police. What we didn't want to happen was for both drivers to be taken for chemical testing if only one had a violation, because we didn't want to go against any constitutional provisions or rulings that have been made lately in North Dakota. Basically, it said, hey, if there's not probable cause, you shouldn't be given chemical tests. So we wanted to limit that just to the one that was cited. If there's no citation, of course, nobody has to have one, but we got to protect ourselves against egregious overreach of the law.
So the state police believe that the current existing law is unconstitutional?
No, they say if we don't have some probable cause, it will be. So right now it's just fatalities. If we want to include this extra category, we put a safeguard in here to protect against any lack of probable cause.
So right now the law is, without any changes, that there's a fatality.
That's correct.
Then someone can be
chemically tested,
regardless of whether they get a citation or not.
That's right. That's correct. And this one, we're just going to add suspected serious injury, but only in the case for the driver that was cited.
And is it only in case of the driver who's cited for serious bodily injury? But if there's a fatality, neither person needs
no, fatality will
citation?
stay the same way it is right now, that both have to be chemically tested, period. But this will be just in those cases where there was no fatality but a suspected serious injury.
And so they believe that there's no constitutional problem if there's a fatality, but there's a constitutional problem if there's a serious bodily injury?
That appears to be the case. So I'm trying not to mess with present law other than to add this provision.
I'm obviously haven't studied that, but that seems to me hard to digest that there's a differentiation
And
between
we
probable
had
cause
some-
and a fatality and a
We had
serious
some
bodily
judges
injury.
comment on this, and they think this protects us, and
Okay.
Louisiana State Police is going along with it, and that's why we adopted that.
Okay, and in terms of what is the purpose of changing the term serious bodily injury to suspected serious injury?
That is to bring it in compliance with the federal standards. So what we're doing in the state is they're redoing the uniform crash report to match the federal standards, and they use the term suspected serious injury. And what we're trying to do is limit those claims for just, minor bruises, because it actually says other than minor bruises in that subparagraph D. So we're trying to limit those, trivial lawsuits or whatever. We want to make sure this is an actual thing.
And so this description of any of the following severe lacerations, broken extremities, crash injuries, is that verbatim from this model minimum uniform crash criteria?
It is.
guideline? It's
Yes, sir.
verbatim. Okay. Thank you, Representative Cruz.
Thank you.
For a question on the amendment, Representative Stefanski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Cruz, I'm looking on that, and I know you said you just copied that from the federal guidelines, but what's a crash injury?
What is a crash? Something sustained in a crash as a result of a crash.
Doesn't that seem a little broad?
You're talking about FC?
Yeah, talking about FC.
It does, but unfortunately, that's the federal definition, and they need something to be in compliance with without so much interpretation on their part. So that's kind of why they're going with this.
And my worry is just that could be, it's so overly broad. An officer could at any time really say, well, you have a crash injury. I mean, if you're saying my arm kind of hurts, that's a crash injury. My back hurts, anything, to where I don't think it meets what your intent is, to where there's really a serious injury. And I'm not harping on you because I know you just copied that language, but that's something that I think needs to be addressed maybe along the process if it gets out of this body. Just to maybe tailor that down a little bit, because that seems a little overbroad to me.
Actually, I agree with you. I think it's a good point.
Okay. Thank you, Representative Cruz.
There are no other questions on the amendment. Is there any objection to the adoption of the amendment? Without objection, the amendment is adopted. Is there another amendment, Mr. Clerk? No. For a question on the bill, Representative McGee.
Thank you, Representative Cruz. Who's paying for the drug tests?
Who's paying for? Whoever normally does. I'm actually not trying to change anything that we do currently. So when we give a chemical test now, that's the way it's going to stay then.
So we're not sure who's paying for the drug test? Is it
I'm
the
not.
state or is it the insurance company?
I believe it's a state, but I don't know offhand.
Is there a fiscal note tied to increase the amount of drug testing post-accident?
None that I'm aware of, no.
Thank you.
For a question on the bill, Representative Marino.
How did you come up with this model minimum uniform crash criteria guideline is the
That's a federal thing. And what they do, the Louisiana copies, basically, they emulate what they do on the federal standard. And that was just changed, I believe, a couple of weeks ago. And so now they're trying to adopt that into their crash report here in the state, the Department of Public Safety.
when I'm looking it up online to see what the model minimum uniform crash criteria is, it is a minimum standardized data set for describing crashes. What does that have to do with injuries or?
Well, what happens is when a trooper or law enforcement goes out there, they have this form, and that's how they grade things. And box A is fatality, and box B used to be serious bodily injury, and now it's going to be suspected injury, suspected serious injury. So we're trying to make it as easy for them and to remove any real liability from them to realize, hey, I checked A or B. It's time for a chemical test if I issued a citation for a driver here on the suspected injury side.
Right, and my concern is the same that I've already heard from other people, is that some of these are real clear, the severe laceration and broken, distorted extremities, but the crash injury causes a lot of concern for me as well, because it basically says any injury at all. I mean, it doesn't fit with the rest. Like when you're trying to get serious bodily injury, it doesn't equate at all with
Right,
the words
right.
crash injury.
I agree with you on that. I
So
agree with you. At this point, I don't know exactly how to address that, other than to let you know we're just trying to be in conformity with the federal guidelines.
Thank you.
There are no other questions. Representative Cruz, you have a right to close.
Members, this is just really just addressing a gap in the law right now. Like I said, we had a fatality, but it was a week later, so there's no chemical testing. Subsequently, the driver was found to have all kinds of drug paraphernalia in the vehicle, had his operator's permit removed several times, and we're just trying to address those cases here. So I appreciate your favorable vote.
Representative Cruz moves final passage of the bills. Many in favor of final passage vote yes. Those opposed vote no. The clerk will open the machine. Vote your machines, members. Are you through voting? Representative Abramson, no. Representative Gary Carter, yes. Representative Arms, yes. Representative Scheck-Snyder, yes. Representative Davis, yes. Are you through voting, members? Representative Berthelot, yes. Clerk will close the machine. 66 yeas, 30 nays. The bill is finally passed. Representative Cruz moves to adopt the title. Representative Cruz moves to reconsider which bill finally passed and lay that motion on the table without objection. So ordered.